and in our government. And I would ask, just for a moment, how many of you have attended tea parties, town halls? Thank you. Thank you for your participation. I've made it a habit over the years to carry my Constitution in my pocket as a reminder of what this country and what this country's government is all about. But more recently, because of the participation of many of you, I've added something to my Constitution. I've added a tea bag. I've added a tea bag because without the Boston Tea Party, we never would have had the Declaration of Independence. We never would have had the Revolutionary War. We never would have had the formulation of this Constitution and the creation of this great country. And it's the principles of the Tea Party that I think are so important to us today. The principles of people speaking out against power, speaking out for freedom, speaking out for opportunity and free enterprise, which is what made this great country of ours so great over the years. I am a candidate for the U.S. Senate. I'm a candidate for the U.S. Senate because I think it's time for Washington to put the American people first. Many years ago, I raised my right hand as a young military officer at Fort Benning, Georgia. And I swore an oath to uphold the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America. And at the time that I swore that oath, I was given the U.S. Army Officer's Guide. And in that guide, it had a code of government ethics. And part of the code I put on the back of all my cards. And what that code says is public office is a public trust. Public office is a public trust. So when I assumed the power and the privileges and the authority of a young military officer, it was not about me as a person. It was about my soldiers. It was about the chain of command. It was about the mission that we were given. And years later, when I swore a similar oath as a CIA officer, and then as a state representative, a member of Congress, and even as a business advocate of the state of Connecticut, for me and for others like me, like Senator Caligari, it was the people we served. The people we served. Our public office was a public trust to serve the people. Let me just say this. I'm proud to be a Vietnam veteran. I'm proud to have served for 20 months in that difficult place. I'm proud to have been shoulder to shoulder with 58,229 brave young men and women who gave their lives, and many others who gave their time, their energy, their bodies, their minds, their service, and their sacrifice. And at a time when the Central Intelligence Agency has been criticized by those in power, I can also say I'm proud to be a CIA officer, to have served in the CIA on difficult and dangerous missions abroad, fighting communism, fighting for freedom and democracy, fighting for the fundamental principles that I felt we all shared as Americans. But I didn't spend 20 months in Vietnam, and I didn't spend 10 years in the CIA fighting communism during the Cold War. To come back home to my country, to come back home to my home state, and to see the principles and the values for which we fought now put aside. I think that the current president and the current Congress have put our economy on a crash course with reality, that the spending, the deficits, and promise of higher taxes are going to saddle our children and our grandchildren with enormous debt. And although it's popular to say that this problem has been inherited from a previous administration, and I will be the first to admit that during my service in Congress and during the previous administration, mistakes were made. mistakes were made, and we can learn from those mistakes. But what we must learn is that doing the same wrong thing into the future will not solve the problem we have. And we must learn from our mistakes. Now, when the Chinese communists, as Peter Schiff made reference to earlier in his remarks, when the Chinese communists are telling us that we're headed in the wrong direction, we need to listen. We need to listen to what they have to say. The national debt is now projected to double by 2012 and nearly triple by the end of the decade. By my calculation, that is more debt than we have accumulated from George Washington to George W. Bush. All those years combined are now exceeded by the debt with which we are currently confronted. And our children, who are born today and tomorrow, will have $40,000 of debt on them before we change the first diaper. This is unacceptable. This is something that we need to correct. And we have to ask ourselves, are we better off today having the same people who are running America's Treasury, running Bank of America? Are we better off today having the same people who operate the Department of Motor Vehicles, operating General Motors, or what some call Government Motors, the new GM? Are we better off having the Federal Emergency Management Administration running our emergency rooms? And I would argue that the case is no. I would also argue that in my political life, I have done my best to oppose higher taxes, which I say take away our freedom. I go back to 1991, when as a young man who had just moved back to Connecticut from Washington, D.C., I ran for state representative. And at the time, the issue before us was an income tax for Connecticut. An income tax for Connecticut. I ran in a special election, and at the time I was solicited by Governor Weicker to receive his endorsement for the Connecticut Party. In exchange for the endorsement, I would commit to vote for his income tax. Now, we all recall during that difficult period of time, he ran on a position of saying that an income tax for the state of Connecticut was like putting gasoline on a fire. Anybody remember that? Gasoline on a fire. I remember that. And I also remember that within a few days or a week or so after his election, he appointed Bill Sibbis to take over his Office of Policy and Management, what the senator and I call OPM. It also stands for Other People's Money, right? Other People's Money. And that made it clear the income tax was coming. So I turned the governor down. And I said, no, I'm running as a Republican. I will not run on the Connecticut Party line in exchange for a commitment to vote for the income tax. And I was fortunate that a few weeks later I did win the race and I was sworn in. And once again, I was invited to the governor's office. And the governor had a row of television cameras in front of us. And he swirled me around and put me in front of the cameras and said, I'm certain that Rob Simmons will be with me on the income tax.